Zhang Yuan lay on the ground and stared thoughtfully in front of him. His face was dirty, as were his clothes. Green light streamed around him. It seems that this shadow also had its own range. Zhang Yuan had to find a way to keep his distance from him. Zhang Yuan held the gun in one hand, glancing at the two men standing not far away from him. He wondered what the two of them might be whispering about. A real amateur show about detectives. The man with the light brown hair smiled mockingly and pointed in Zhang Yuan's direction, saying that he was the reason the snakes had bitten his comrades, and there was all the evidence for that. The dark-haired warrior next to him scratched his head tiredly, watching Zhang Yuan closely, and told his comrade that it was time to stop and tie Zhang Yuan up. The young man immediately roused himself, frowning. One of them was poaching during the exercise, and the other didn't say a word to Zhang Yuan. They were definitely conspiring to kill Zhang Yuan. Zhang Yuan wrapped both hands around the gun and loaded it. He pointed the gun at the men and began to shoot fire at them. The men dodged the shots without much difficulty. The warrior with a mocking smile told Zhang Yuan to give up, since he wouldn't be able to break through his defense. Zhang Yuan crouched on the ground and confidently declared that they would definitely not be able to defeat him. The men continued to watch him calmly. Did Zhang Yuan have any tricks up her sleeve? They would really like to see them. The brown-haired man smiled crazily and furrowed his brows as he looked in Zhang Yuan's direction. He said that once Zhang Yuan died, he would have his precious sister. Zhang Yuan's heart sank instantly. A hostile aura began to radiate from him, and he clenched his hands into fists, and a stream of air enveloped the guy. He seriously told the people in front of him that if they laid a finger on his sister, he would grind them to powder right away. The warrior turned back to his colleague in displeasure and asked him what he had just blurted out. A system notification was displayed that said, "Your super perception ability has been improved. You have received a new ability, Heat Stroke, catastrophic level, can be upgraded. Heat Stroke, extract the temperature from the air and release that heat within a 10,000 meter radius. Your freeze skill has been improved." Zhang Yuan frowned and looked in front of him with a vicious gaze. Another system notification was displayed, which said, "You have received a new ability, Ice Cover. Ice Cover, you can freeze all objects within a 10,000 meter radius. Your regeneration skill has been improved. You have received a new ability, Immortal Ghost. Immortal Ghost, you are immune to all attacks and negative effects." Zhang Yuan began to be enveloped by an icy light, and many ice shards appeared around him. Just 30 seconds. No matter what it was, he was ready to make the most of this time. Zhang Yuan extended his hand in front of him towards the men, and the rolling of ice peaks stretched from him to them. The warrior immediately froze, turning into an ice statue, and the partner standing next to him managed to react better, using a health improvement spell on himself. The brown-haired man opened his mouth in surprise, a look of shock on his face. He was surprised by such incredible strength. If it wasn't for Fenmo's protection, not a single grain of them would have been left. The man put his arm around the warrior's shoulder, repeating the phrase "return to the sun" over and over again. However, this didn't help much. No, the ambient temperature was too low, and everything froze in just a matter of seconds. It required a lot of energy for this skill. Zhang Yuan bent down, breathing heavily. He continued to hold his hand, casting a spell and freezing everything around him. He had lost almost all of his power in a single use of the spell, so there was no way to delay. Zhang Yuan grabbed the gun in his hands and pointed it at the men. The warrior had only half thawed, staring ahead in surprise. His colleague was also startled by what he saw. Zhang Yuan held the gun tightly and was ready to fire, shouting "die" to them at the end. However, there was no shot fired. Everything was fine, because the gun was also frozen. Zhang Yuan opened his mouth wide and looked at the gun that was completely covered in a crust of ice. It was like he had run out of luck after all. He hung his head and looked at the ground with a sad smile. His hands and feet were frozen, as was the gun he was holding. Zhang Yuan fell to the ground. Even if he dies, he won't allow it. The warrior was holding his colleague by the waist. They were covered in abrasions and dirt. Their faces looked both surprised and displeased. Was it really possible to increase one's damage by as much as 448 with the power-up? But then, anything higher is Kryptonite's ability, and Zhang Yuan just surpassed that power. The brown-haired man turned to the warrior and urged him to help him. They got closer to Zhang Yuan, who was still lying on the ground, exhausted. The man activated the Return to the Sun ability, and Zhang Yuan was enveloped in a circle of green color. The man's hand began to emit a light green glow. He frowned gravely. He couldn't just let Zhang Yuan go, so he definitely didn't have any right to die. Suddenly, the man collapsed right next to Zhang Yuan, causing the warrior who was looking down at them and the only one left standing to put his hand to his forehead and let out a sigh of displeasure. He had no choice but to put his arm around Zhang Yuan's shoulders, leaning him on top of him, and he just took his brown-haired colleague by the ankle and dragged him by the leg on the ground. He was indignant and said to himself that Feng King was such a fool, and why he couldn't help but look for an extra adventure on his fifth point. And he was a fool to have followed him into this. Night had already fallen. It was dark outside, and there was no sun in sight. A huge multi-story hospital with a red burning cross sign stood in the middle of the street. The screen showed a steady pulse, periodically emitting a beeping sound. A voice rang out, asking if there was no way to save him anymore. Her temperature dropped, her heart rate and blood pressure disappeared. That technique killed the young man. Zhang Yuan was lying on the bed with his eyes closed. A doctor and a nurse were standing next to his bed, and a dark-haired warrior was standing behind them. All of a sudden, Feng King burst into their office, shouting at the entire ward to be let in immediately. He unceremoniously began to push the doctor and nurse out with his hands on their backs, and then said that Zhang Yuan was just in a state of suspended animation and that's all. The warrior moved closer to Zhang Yuan's bed. He interrupted Feng King and pointed a finger in Zhang Yuan's direction, asking if his colleague was sure of what he was saying, since there were even corpse stains on him. Feng King turned around in surprise at his words and asked where exactly they were, wanting to take a look at these very spots. He once again used his return to the sun ability on him, shrouding the youth in green light. Feng King said that everything was actually fine, but Zhang Yuan's body wasn't stained, just a couple of small bruises, and the warrior didn't know what he was talking about. The man asked incredulously if he was lying to him. Feng King folded his arms and looked down at Zhang Yuan, asking about whether he could actually answer this question and tell exactly whether Zhang Yuan was alive or dead. The man had a phone in his hand. On the blue screen of the phone, young contact list was written and 99 names of various students were listed, with Xuan Ming and Feng Yumo being the last to be entered. The warrior moved closer to him and looked at his phone, asking if it was too ridiculous. Feng King replied that Zhang Yuan had beaten him twice, and if his real name was mentioned, it would definitely not be a problem. The warrior shrugged and said that in that case, he would tell them later what a stupid name he had chosen for Zhang Yuan. Zhang Yuan's faint voice interrupted their conversation. He mumbled in displeasure about how it was too noisy here. He jumped up abruptly, sitting down on the bed and shouting at both of them to shut up immediately. The two men started in surprise, then turned to each other and continued their conversation. Feng King complacently said that he was right and Zhang Yuan was indeed in a state of suspended animation, just like he said, to which the warrior only tisked in displeasure. Zhang Yuan only thought about what was going on here at all, and since when did they suddenly become so friendly? Zhang Yuan picked up the phone and frowned as the screen flashed on. A notification was displayed, which contained the content of the message: "Little brother, have you been injured and hospitalized? I'm doing well, and my teachers and classmates are taking care of me. Have a good rest and recover, don't worry about me, don't forget to call me when you wake up." Zhang Yuan was surprised. Has it really been 2 days? They didn't send him to the morgue, but just left him here. The brown-haired man interrupted Zhang Yuan's thoughts and put his hands in his pockets, introducing himself with a slight smile and saying that his name was Feng King and he was the student council president. And what happened to Zhang Yuan was all his fault. Feng King apologized to him. His smile widened slightly and he extended his hand towards Zhang Yuan, saying that although they didn't know each other, they were speaking on behalf of the other party. Then he invites Zhang Yuan to join them. Zhang Yuan gloomily asked if they really didn't know each other before. Feng King looked at him questioningly, and in the same second, he was hit in the face by a precise punch to the jaw. Feng King flew into the wall, descending it and crouching on the floor. He uncomprehendingly touched the spot of impact. Zhang Yuan stood up and smiled, extending his hand and telling him that they definitely knew each other now. Zhang Lan sat across from the woman with a worried expression on her face. The woman sitting across from her remained calm, and the man standing behind her was telling Zhang Lan to calm down and not worry if she made a mistake. There was a red crystal on the table. Zhang Lan carefully took the crystal in her hand and looked at the object in her palms uncertainly. The man added that she just needed to pick it up and try to feel the energy contained inside the crystal. The woman sitting across from her stretched out her hand towards the crystal and told her to try it. A bright light began to form inside the crystal. The probability of successfully absorbing a crystal is a bare statistic. In fact, it all depends on a person's talent and mental state. The woman continued to watch Zhang Lan carefully and inwardly kept reassuring her that everything was fine. Zhang Lan held the crystal tightly in her hands, and it was illuminated by a bright light, so bright that she had to close her eyes tightly and clench her teeth. This world is full of monsters, and only warriors can defeat them. The reason why Uncle Lin was so kind to her and her brother was because he clearly counted on her extremely. Zhang Lan wanted to protect this world, to protect her brother. Zhang Lan's eyes snapped open, and a small crystal appeared in front of her face. She was able to discover the fire cloud, and it will take her 20 years of life to absorb it. The system asked her if she was willing to absorb it. Zhang Yuan stood outside with his hands in his pockets. Zhang Lan was running towards him happily, her arms outstretched. Not far from them was a statue of a man with a huge helmet on his head, his arms raised to the sky and spread wide. Zhang Lan ran to her brother's side and saw the red armband that said discipline in his arm. Zhang Lan happily noticed that his form had changed. Zhang Yuan awkwardly scratched the back of his head with a smile on his face and replied that he had joined the student union and become a member of the disciplinary committee, and that was the uniform of the student union members. Zhang Yuan frowned seriously. He had heard from Feng Qing that there would be a week-long vacation after the military training, and Zhang Yuan was probably assigned to this class for a reason. Zhang Lan got in because of her talent, and it was definitely agreed to take him on some special conditions. Zhang Yuan smiled softly and patted the girl's head. He asked his sister Lan if the instructor did anything special for her while he wasn't around. Zhang Lan put her finger to her lips thoughtfully and looked down, replying to her brother that it didn't seem like anything, but Uncle Lin had given her a fire cloud crystal so that she could absorb it. Zhang Yuan was startled. Zhang Lan clenched her hand into a fist and smiled contentedly, holding out her hand in the shape of a pistol towards Zhang Yuan. She said with a smile that she was now the strongest warrior and that she could now safely protect Zhang Yuan. Zhang Yuan thought to himself with a serious face that even in this lifetime, Zhang Lan couldn't escape the fate of a team leader, and all Zhang Yuan could do in this situation was to become stronger to protect her. Zhang Lan grabbed her brother's hand and puffed out her cheeks, asking why didn't Zhang Yuan ask her about exactly what ability she got. Zhang Yuan smilingly asked the girl what kind of ability it was. Zhang Lan replied that her ability was super speed and heavenly origin. Zhang Yuan turned to look at her questioningly. The girl ran away from her brother and ran to the statue with her arms outstretched. She ran to the statue and kicked it, breaking the statue in two. Zhang Yuan was startled as the proud and satisfied girl ran back to her brother's side. With burning eyes, she asked, wasn't she the coolest after that? Zhang Yuan smiled awkwardly and held out his hand in front of him, saying that even though Sister Lan had become stronger, even that wouldn't save her from being held responsible for damaging public property. On the table was a sheet of paper marked explanatory. The silver-haired woman sighed heavily and put her hand to her face. Zhang Yuan and his sister were standing in front of her desk, the other one still smiling innocently. The woman told them that everything was fine, but the only request is just not to break anything else. Zhang Lan, with the same harmless smile on her face, turned around and took Zhang Yuan's arm, continuing to push him in the back. The girl nodded in response to the woman's request and added that of course, and that it was time for them to go in that case. Zhang Yuan looked at his sister and thought that they didn't even have to pay for the damage they caused, which was quite strange. Isn't this a very generous gesture on the part of the administration? The woman glanced over her shoulder at the guys who were leaving and spoke to Zhang Yuan, telling him that he had performed well at the military training camp and would he like to try to absorb the crystal. She also added that she would be happy to help him with this case. Zhang Yuan turned around at the woman's words. Didn't Feng Qing tell her anything about what happened? The guy responded and thanked the woman for her kindness, but he didn't think he needed the instructor's help. Zhang Yuan and his sister quickly left the office, slamming the door behind them. The woman turned back and sighed heavily. Zhang Yuan might not be particularly interested, but there was no need to make it so obvious. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted. She noticed that Zhang Yuan was wearing a student uniform. The council was Feng Qing planning to find a successor at the training camp, and he decided to choose Zhang Yuan as the successor. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, glinting off the windows of a multi-story building. This building was reconstructed at a special request. There was a training ground at the bottom, a living area at the top, and furniture was also inside the building. And if you suddenly needed something, you could just say it. Zhang Yuan, Feng Qing, and a familiar man accompanied them as they walked through the building's gymnasium. Zhang Yuan looked around and carefully looked around. The gym was quite large, and there were different sports equipment in different places. Zhang Yuan said that he needed a room for one, and that the student council president should be able to do that. Feng Qing adjusted his sunglasses on his nose and smiled, saying that Zhang Yuan just needed to say something and he would do it. A man with brown hair and blue eyes was walking with them. He frowned and said that he had promised to teach him how to handle a gun, and when they planned to start doing it. Zhang Yuan calmly replied that they could start right away. Feng Qing held up his index finger and replied with a smile that everything was fine, and they could finally see him in action. There was a clank of discarded tools. Zhang Yuan collapsed with the man on the ground, and both of them sighed tiredly. The man fell on his back and put his hand on his stomach, trying to catch his breath, while Zhang Yuan lay face first on the ground. The man said wearily that they needed a break, and Zhang Yuan said that they needed to clean up quickly. The man only said in surprise that he still had the strength left. Zhang Yuan stood up and looked at his hands. He felt as if he had felt someone touch him. The warrior said that it was already 3 o'clock in the morning, and he needed to eat quickly and get back to training. Feng Qing added that there are snacks on the second floor, but his legs aren't working at all. Zhang Yuan ignored the two of them and headed for the stairs, and the men who were lying down just howled indignantly, "Why is Zhang Yuan not listening to any fatigue at all?" The man lying next to Feng King added that he was so tired, and this scoundrel didn't even have a talent for cold weapons. He rolled over on his back and sighed wearily, saying that usually warriors entering the academy have good fighting skills and they can learn everything quickly in 10 minutes. And Zhang Yuan couldn't handle swords, pistols, or literally anything at all. Zhang Yuan had already made it back. He had several cans of drinks in his hands. He moved closer, going down to the stairs, and tossed them each a can. Feng King intercepted the discarded jar and immediately became animated, saying that he was finally alive again. Zhang Yuan calmly said that in that case, they could finally continue. The men immediately jumped up and said indignantly that all 3 minutes of a break after a 10-hour training session. Feng King said that he was only half alive and needed another jar. Zhang Yuan stepped on the empty jar, crushing it. He agreed, and so be it. They can rest a little longer. Zhang Yuan picked up the crushed jar and threw it over his back into the trash. The men opened their mouths in surprise. Did he hit the bucket from 10 meters away? And maybe this was Zhang Yuan's hidden talent. The man walked up to him and handed him 2 more empty cans, telling him with a smile on his face to try throwing out 2 cans at once. Zhang Yuan had no trouble getting into the trash can. The man was inspired and came closer to the guy, grabbing his arm. He said that the best option for Zhang Yuan would be a hidden weapon. Zhang Yuan calmly looked back at the warrior and asked if this weapon would be as beautiful as a sword, to which the man hesitated a bit. He put a hand to his chin and wondered if there might be a point in using the plains badger crystal as well. He was fearless, good at fighting, and he had an excellent nose. Rage Strike will help you level up your abilities faster, and there will be no such need for weapons. He remembered once encountering one like this in an operation. A huge creature that looked like a giant cat was running towards him. Its eyes glowed red, and there were sharp spikes on its back, tail, and paws. After activating his abilities, his combat power increased by 10 times, and it was very difficult to deal with him in this state. In the end, it took them 3 squads to kill him. The boys sat in front of each other on the floor, forming a circle. Feng King asked if it was the Badger King, and then what happened. The warrior replied that they had given his crystal to the government. Zhang Yuan asked where exactly he could get this crystal from now on. It wasn't just the crystal that he needed, but the royal one. The warrior smiled and pointed his finger in Zhang Yuan's direction and replied that he couldn't teach him how to use weapons, so as compensation, he asked Zhang Yuan to let him settle this matter for him. The man got to his feet and started walking away from them, adding that he was going to return to Guangyuan and could he send a letter to the academy's address if anything happened. Feng King smiled and told Zhang Yuan that he could trust this man. Zhang Yuan frowned and said that he just left at 3 in the morning, and was he really some kind of demon in his eyes? Feng King smiled and replied that he was definitely not afraid of him, and that he just wanted to finish Zhang Yuan's case quickly so that he could find the crystals for his brother as soon as possible. Zhang Yuan asked what kind of crystals he was talking about. Feng King tilted his head, looking at Zhang Yuan from under his brows. He explained that snow snake crystals are immune to death. A young man was lying on the bed. There were a lot of pipes coming out of his body, and he was wearing an oxygen mask on his face. The warrior approached him with a box of snow snake crystals in his hands. There were many red spots on the patient's body, and he didn't move much. He raised his voice and addressed the sick man as a brother, and added that he had brought the snow snake crystals, and although there was little hope, it was worth a try. The patient sat up in bed and said nothing. His hair was pulled back and he was wearing glasses. The man added that when he becomes the head of the family, he will do everything to return his brother's surname. The office door slammed shut. The sick man pondered and thought to himself that his brother was a fool. After all, the real cause of his illness was the Feng family. A huge shadow of purple and dark flowers appeared behind him. Despite his indignation, he was still willing to take the crystals. A shadowy hand appeared from his back and took one of the many crystals in the box. The crystal in his hand sparkled with blue light, illuminating the room brightly. A system notification flashed, stating that the shadow servant had acquired the ability, Death Immunity. The patient roused himself. Zhang Yuan was standing outside. The sun was already setting outside. In front of him was a plump young man with purple eyes and an orange uniform, wearing a hat with rabbit ears. He held the box in his hands with a smile and said that the delivery was not easy, so he would be grateful if Zhang Yuan left a small good review. Zhang Yuan nodded thoughtfully and took the package from the delivery man's hand. The guy started to get back on his bank and added that in the future, Zhang Yuan could contact him by phone and get a 20% discount. Zhang Yuan opened the package, looking at the contents inside. The box contained a lot of bright iridescent stones. Zhang Yuan looked at them carefully and thought that these must be the badger crystals that he had been told about. Suddenly, he noticed a folded note laying right in the middle of the box on the rocks. Zhang Yuan picked up the note and opened it. It said, "Since you left that day without saying goodbye, I can't sleep or eat. I never thought that one day we would be able to meet again. See you at the fishing pier on September 15th at 20:00. Zhang Yuan was a little taken aback as he looked at the contents of the note. Did this guy write a love letter? And who is this woman? Zhang Yuan thought about what he should do now that he hadn't taken Feng Mo's number. Maybe I should have asked Feng King directly. He immediately conjured up an image of a man bursting into laughter. This was definitely not an option, because he would probably take a picture of this letter and then publish it somewhere. Just at the next meeting he will give the letter to him. Zhang Yuan smiled and decided it was about time. He picked up one of the badger stones. Zhang Yuan was enveloped in bright lightning, flashing with a bright light. The guy was looking at the crystal in his hand. A system notification flashed that said, "A ghost badger crystal has been found that can be consumed." The ghost badger crystal has the following abilities: Fearless, green, can't be upgraded. Rage Strike, green, level 1, can be upgraded. Poison Eater, green, can't be upgraded. Fearlessness, eliminates mind control. Rage Strike, improves random combat skill. Poison Eater, immune to all poisons. The higher the toxin concentration in the body, the stronger the ability. The maximum increase in attack power does not exceed 148%. The crystal in Zhang Yuan's hands dissolved, forming into bright rays. He ordered the crystal to consume everything. A system notification flashed that said, "Rage Strike, blue, level 2. Zhang Yuan's hand reached for his sword, and he activated the Rage Strike ability. Zhang Yuan began to swing his sword from side to side in a deft manner. He smiled contentedly, putting his sword in a crouch. Now it was clear why he needed the sword after all. There was a sign on the wooden door that read Student Council Meeting Room. A loud voice shouted that he didn't agree with freshman Zhang Yuan's entry. It was Leibo, a member of the Student Council's propaganda committee. He had short hair on his head that stuck out in all directions. He frowned in displeasure and clenched his hand into a fist, asking the people in front of him about when someone like Zhang Yuan could join them. Zhang Yuan, and as a member of the disciplinary committee. It was ridiculous. There were a lot of people sitting around a huge table in the hall. A girl told Leibo not to get excited. The president just took Zhang Yuan to run errands for him. Feng King was sitting in the center, his hands clenched in thought. One of the guys said that he didn't think so, because the members of the disciplinary committee should be different in strength and morals, and therefore they can't take just anyone. Next to him was Zhang Zhuo, the headmaster's secretary, the board that spoke second. The man added that he was also a former member of the disciplinary committee, and he could not agree with this kind of decision. Feng King asked the man to explain himself with a smirk. This guy was Shan Guanyi, a former member of the disciplinary committee. He frowned in displeasure and said that Zhang Yuan could join, but only as an assistant. There were many students in the classroom. A teacher with large glasses was standing behind a stand in front of them, holding a book in front of him, reading out a fragment from it. He said that a crystal becomes a crystal only after the death of the creature in which that crystal existed as energy. Zhang Yuan raised his hand and asked the teacher, "After a person dies, does a crystal also appear from it in this case?" The teacher replied that it was impossible to compare the structure of a person with the structure of representatives of other races. Zhang Yuan asked another question and said, "What would happen if someone absorbed the crystal and gave birth to a child?" The teacher sighed wearily and looked in Zhang Yuan's direction, replying that it was strictly forbidden for pregnant women to experiment with crystals, and it was best that Zhang Yuan not get carried away with such thoughts so much. After a while, Zhang Yuan was sitting in the dining room next to his sister Zhang Lan. Zhang Yuan kept telling her that her sister was still growing up, and that was why she needed to try to eat more, to which the girl only became indignant and told Zhang Yuan that she was no longer a child. Feng King walked over to their table, placing his tray on their table and intending to sit across from them. The man told Zhang Yuan that his sister was even cuter than others said she was. Zhang Yuan frowned and warned menacingly for the third-year students to take a step to the side. Feng King smiled and held up his hands, telling Zhang Yuan to stop, because he would have to wait for his sister Zhang Lan to come of age anyway. Zhang Yuan clenched his hand into a fist and asked the guy to repeat what he had just said. The man chuckled in response and said that Zhang Yuan was going a little too far, and was she really his sister? Zhang Lan smiled and clung to Zhang Yuan's hand, saying that of course, it couldn't be any other way. Feng King grinned and thought of something indecent in his head, to which Zhang Yuan immediately reacted and slapped him, indignantly asking what the president of the university was thinking. The council, Lan asked what this meant, to which Zhang Yuan replied that she was still too young for such things. Feng King climbed into his seat and smiled, saying that it was all just a joke. Zhang Lan recognized the man in front of her as the one she was talking to on the phone when Zhang Yuan was admitted to the hospital, and the man confirmed this, allowing the girl to address him as Feng King. Zhang Lan frowned in displeasure and pointed her finger in Feng King's direction, telling him that his glasses were broken, and if he continued to wear them, he might get hurt in this way. The man told her that he had special glasses and that without them, he would scare people, to which Lan asked if she could take a look. Feng King lowered his glasses slightly on his nose and replied that for the sake of a beauty like her, he would make an exception today. He showed her his eyes, which gave off a bright purple glow. Zhang Lan's eyes lit up and she opened her mouth in admiration, telling Feng King that not only were his eyes very beautiful, they were also glowing. Zhang Yuan calmly asked what his talent was. Feng King smiled and replied that when his mother was 3 months pregnant, she couldn't absorb the crystal, so he ended up absorbing it. He was born a true warrior, and his body was stronger than that of ordinary people. Zhang Yuan pondered. His teacher had told him today that such things were strictly forbidden, even though it didn't really matter to him, because it had absolutely nothing to do with him. Feng King added and said that he almost forgot to mention that Zhang Yuan was now a member of the disciplinary committee, so he would have to go on patrol at lunchtime. Zhang Yuan clarified that wasn't he going to be kicked out recently. Feng King replied that the council members were nice guys, and would his sister like some spicy chicken, by the way. Zhang Lan didn't interrupt at all until the last words, clapping her hands happily. Feng King had said that the academy was a decent place, there were almost no fights here, but things were different in the union recently. However, it was fine and they would sort it out, and Feng King would definitely help Zhang Yuan in making sure that no one died. Zhang Lan exclaimed happily and said that since Zhang Yuan was going to go on patrol, she would definitely go with him, but the young man with a serious face said no, and that his sister was not allowed to skip class, to which Zhang Lan howled in displeasure and said that she did not want to go to class at all. Zhang Yuan left the building and walked through the streets. The girls turned around and whispered that there was a new member of the disciplinary committee and he was quite good looking. Zhang Yuan activated super perception. He felt like he was being chased by someone, and why couldn't they find some more private place for their showdown? The 2 men in gray suits and caps continued to follow him, following close behind. Zhang Yuan abruptly turned around and told them that at 3 o'clock, behind a pillar 15 meters away, and don't let any of them be late. The man with short dark hair smiled. He teased and said that Zhang Yuan had discovered them so quickly without any special skills. Let him take off his clothes, get down on his knees and bark, and only then, perhaps, will he let him go. Zhang Yuan smiled grimly and asked if this was a kind of academy greeting, and that he was in business. The man spread out his hands and chuckled, telling Zhang Yuan that he was apparently quite an obedient boy. Zhang Yuan asked him what he was talking about, because Zhang Yuan meant that if he undressed, knelt down, and gave a bark, he would let him go. The man immediately rushed towards Zhang Yuan with a fist in his direction and shouted loudly. Activating the ability, terrifying sound waves caused the target to have a mental shock and paralyze it. Zhang Yuan chuckled, his eye lighting up with a bright light. He mockingly asked why the man opened his mouth. Zhang Yuan activated the Dauntless ability, removes mind control. He swung a punch at the man's jaw, sending him flying several meters away. Zhang Yuan said that it was now too late to beg for mercy. The guy began to deftly and quickly beat the enemy. The man collapsed, and the shocked companions looked in his direction in horror. It was impossible. Only a few people had managed to resist this trick before, and what kind of guy was Zhang Yuan? Zhang Yuan looked in the direction of the fleeing guys. He asked them if they weren't going to take him to the hospital. The guys barely managed to break away. A nightmare who could just attack a harmless person. Zhang Lan abruptly blocked their path, pointing a finger in their direction and ordering them to stop. The girl exuded an incredible aura, so strong that cracks began to appear on the ground where she was standing. She ordered to get the man's phone and advised him to give it to her in a nice way. The man immediately begged for mercy and handed the girl the phone, bowing his head. Lan smiled and picked up her phone, pointing the camera at the 2 men. With a smile, she told him to put him down on the ground and let the guy lean on 2 hands. The man hesitated slightly at her words, saying that it was a little too much, but she handed the phone back and said with a smile that the pose was great. She began photographing the unconscious man from different angles and laughed contentedly, saying that she would have to send this photo to his friends. She put her hands on her hips and ordered the men to repost. They bowed their heads to her and asked her to let them go, and that they promised that they would definitely do everything. Zhang Lan told them to make sure to explain to their friend later that it was wrong to behave like this. She glanced over her shoulder with a grim smile and said that, by the way, she had filmed absolutely the whole process, and if they disobeyed her, she would throw everything to him. The men dropped to their knees wearily as the girl continued to skip away, and they also thought that Zhang Yuan was truly evil. The dark-haired man complained to Feng King that this guy was too cruel. Not only did he beat him up, but he also posted a photo. Feng King looked at the contents of the phone with photos on it with a smile on his face. If he'd mentioned this guy earlier, they definitely wouldn't have had so much fun. Feng King added with a smile and told the guy to tell him exactly what Zhang Yuan did to him. The man was lying in the hospital room and slightly raised up on the bed, saying that he used his signature move as usual, but Zhang Yuan not only didn't get hurt, but also pinned him to the ground. The waves didn't affect him, so Zhang Yuan had successfully absorbed fearlessness. Feng King asked what happened next and whether he used a weapon, to which the man shook his head and said no. Feng King wondered how he was able to do it without a weapon. Did Zhang Yuan absorb the rage strike? It was hard to say for sure. The man replied that if Zhang Yuan also had a weapon, he would definitely have killed him by now. Feng King smiled and turned away with a smile, saying that since the guy was still alive, he could go away. The guy jumped up and said that they were now enemies with him, and how should he continue training in this case? Feng King glanced over his shoulder at him and replied that no one cared about him anyway, and that he could stay at home for a couple of months and then come back. The man held out his hand to the president and asked him to help him, but Feng King remained expressionless and replied that such injuries could not be cured with his technique, then slammed the door and walked away. Feng King sat across from the guy and asked what it was that he had, to which he was told that it was a badge for the 68th place. Feng King said that this was an official battle power ranking that only involved young people under the age of 28. Zhang Yuan looked at the phone screen and saw that Xuan Ming was ranked 68th. Feng King leaned close to the boy's ear and said that he and Brother Feng had been thinking for a long time about how to hide Zhang Yuan's real identity. He asked if he liked the name. Zhang Yuan turned away with an expressionless expression and said why couldn't they just call him Zhang, to which Feng King roused himself and asked if he was serious or not. Zhang Yuan added and asked what this strange rating was even for. Feng King thought that Zhang Yuan was a real repository of talent. A vivid image of the boy appeared in his mind, the real god of war, the king, welcome the new king, Xuan Ming's return, there was no stopping him. Feng King said that if Zhang Yuan didn't advance on the list, there might be questions, and added that he had brought Zhang Yuan a new weapon. He opened 2 boxes of contents, one containing a long sword and the other containing smaller handheld items. He said that this is a development of the Surveillance Bureau kit, an improved version of the trial sample. He asked Zhang Yuan if he would like to try it out. Feng King picked up the sword, but Zhang Yuan quickly answered him and told him that he could leave the weapon and leave. Feng King opened his mouth in surprise and asked why it was so cold to treat him, and what they needed to go to the training ground so that Zhang Yuan could try it out. Zhang Yuan picked up the sword, his eyes boring into it carefully. After a short while, Feng King was lying on the ground, all beaten up. All he could think about was that Zhang Yuan had succeeded, that he had actually managed to absorb the rage strike. Zhang Yuan indifferently told the man that he was crazy. The department at their hospital was pretty good, and that it would be a good idea for Feng King to go there. The man laughed softly and replied that Zhang Yuan had finally learned how to handle edged weapons, and that Daddy was proud of him. After the last words, Zhang Yuan kicked the man and told him to get out quickly. Zhang Yuan looked at the contents carefully. Feng King was really meticulous that even the blades were specially prepared for him. Zhang Yuan picked up the weapon holder and put it on his chest, smiling contentedly as he placed his hands on his sides. Groups of shooters sometimes trained here, so you could try to train with knives with the help of plates. He picked up the phone and looked at the screen that read, the default speed is 120 km per hour, 3 plates fly out at the same time with an interval of 10 seconds, 4 attempts, confirm the start. On top of the device was one huge flask, in which 2 rows of plates were located. He activated the instrument and moved a couple of meters away. The instrument shouted, please get ready and move 20 meters away from the car, the first round will start after 3 beeps. One by one, the plates began to fly out. Zhang Yuan readied the blades, taking 3 in each hand. The machine crackled. Get ready, the next launch is about to start. Get ready, the next launch is about to start. Get ready, the next launch is about to start. One by one, the plates continued to fly out. Zhang Yuan parried each one, driving the blades into the flying plates. A notification flashed that loudly announced, congratulations on completing your first training session, your rating 100 points. Zhang Yuan squatted down, taking out one knife from the plate. As expected, it was simply impossible to stop. Suddenly, another notification sounded, get ready, the next launch is about to start. Zhang Yuan stood up, listening carefully. He thought about how he could try using this thing to raise his own level, which was pretty good, and now he can train every day. It was late afternoon outside, and the setting sun was shining brightly. He finally made it to the next level. Zhang Yuan sat over the car and looked at it carefully, thinking about his own business. In the end, he scored only 80 points, and it seemed to him that he definitely had a lot to grow in the future. Lessons, training sessions, and activities are just like real student life, and there is no assignment from the student union. He looked at the clock on the wall. They showed 18 hours and 20 minutes, September 15th, 2042 years. Zhang Yuan suddenly started up, raising his eyebrows. He had completely forgotten that today was September 15th. Zhang Yuan was standing on the dock, surrounded by blue water. He wondered why the fisherman's wharf was suddenly empty. Suddenly, there was the sound of a helicopter, and he saw a girl with long pink hair throwing down a ladder for him. She ordered him to jump in immediately, and Zhang Yuan only thought that her appearance here was truly unique. Zhang Yuan started to climb up the ladder, and the girl reached out her hand to meet him, which the guy successfully grabbed. Once on board the plane and firmly on her feet, the girl suddenly jerked to him and wrapped her arms around him, holding him to her. She squeezed her eyes shut and loudly stated that she already thought Zhang Yuan wouldn't come, and it wasn't for nothing that she tried so hard. She knew that one day he would understand because of this note. Suddenly, the girl went quiet and looked back at the guy. She looked at him more closely and gave a sharp cry about who he was. Zhang Yun smiled innocently and held up his hands. The girl immediately slumped and fell to the floor, crying. She started complaining that the person assigned to her didn't come and broke her heart, and was she really nothing to him and a completely empty place? Zhang Yun smiled awkwardly and replied that in fact that person didn't see the note, and it got to him, and it was Zhang Yun who came here to explain everything. The girl immediately jumped up and asked, was this all for Zhang Yun's sake and were they friends? Zhang Yun quickly arrived at the edge of the plane and thanked the girl while talking about that now he can go and they can say goodbye to each other. He answered the girl's question positively, keeping a straight face. The girl opened her eyes and mouth in surprise, and after thinking that Zhang Yun was an incredibly proud guy like Enumo, he came to ask for her forgiveness. They must have really been good friends, and Zhang Yun must have been a good warrior as well. The girl abruptly grabbed his shoulder and asked him if Zhang Yun was strong and that it was very important. Zhang Yun hesitantly replied that something like that. The girl nodded confidently. She turned to the helicopter pilot and proudly declared, addressing him as Lao Mao, that they now had a new one and that they needed to get back as soon as possible. The man with short red hair nodded and accepted the order. Zhang Yun just stared at them in disbelief. The girl stood next to Zhang Yun and loudly stated that she wanted to introduce herself. Her name is Kaiji, and she is the leader of the War Gods team. The brown-haired man said his name was Jan Hu and he was in charge of operations. A man with dark hair and an overgrown beard clenched his fist tightly and said with a smile on his face that his name was Xiang Yuba and he was responsible for protecting the entire team. A man with long ponytail hair and glasses on his face briefly said that his name was Wu Jun and he was a doctor. The helicopter pilot gave himself a thumbs up and introduced himself as Mao Wei, the scout. Zhang Yun smiled and waved to the crowd, saying that they could call him Xuan Ming. And Kai reached out and shook the boy's hand, welcoming him to their friendly team. Zhang Yun smiled awkwardly and only thought that he should now take Feng Yumo's place to complete all the tasks. The girl said that Zhang Yun had an incredibly icy hand, and he replied that it was a normal occurrence for ice system users. The doctor looked at them carefully, frowning. It seemed to him that he had definitely seen his name somewhere before. The doctor took out his phone and looked at the screen of the phone. He saw the same name and the fact that it was located on the 68th place in the rating. Everyone took their seats, and Kai sat down with her hands folded in her lap and told Xuan Ming that it would not be an easy task. A week ago, several people entered the facility to engage in poaching. The nearest squads went there some time ago, but all were poisoned by an unknown toxin, and they lost one of their men. The girl frowned sadly and added that Feng Yumo was immune to toxins, so she wanted to ask for his help and that she would understand if the guy didn't want to take part in such a thing. Zhang Yun squinted to the side and replied that they were already there anyway, and he couldn't just sit around waiting in the cockpit of an airplane by himself. The team defender smiled contentedly and noted that Zhang Yun was clearly confident in himself, so he was suggesting sparring. It took Zhang Yun a second to cast the spell and freeze the man next to her. The guy said that they should stop this chatter now and that they didn't have any extra time for it. And Kai came closer and gave a surprised drawl, asking how long this kind of spell would last, and Zhang Yun replied that it was only a couple of minutes. The girl's eyes immediately lit up, and she replied that she didn't even know that freezing could last so long. Zhang Yun shifted his gaze in her direction and awkwardly replied that he actually had another skill that increases the power of the others. He thought uneasily that it was better for him to find an excuse for his strength. The other guys in the team jumped up and surrounded Zhang Yun. The girl asked what other abilities he had, and Zhang Yun replied that one of them was a 1-kilometer heat sensitivity, to which the doctor replied in surprise that this could not be the case. Zhang Yun clarified that the ability was enhanced. The image of a man with dark hair, wearing a raincoat and a bright circle on his back, decorated with crystals, appeared in the doctor's mind. In ancient legends, a hero named Xuanmo was the lord of ice and snow. Zhang Yun must not be much inferior to him. The doctor wondered why he had never heard of such a strong man before. Plus, Zhang Yun was just an ordinary student, and Kai stood next to Zhang Yun and asked if he had a weapon with him, and if a dagger would be suitable in case of emergency. She held a dagger in her hand, holding it out to Zhang Yun. The boy nodded. According to the latest data, the poachers were somewhere in the specified area. A group of people wearing cloaks and hoods pulled over their faces stood in the middle of the forest. It was already dark in the sky, and the small stars were shining brightly. They needed to be alert and keep a strict formation. Zhang Yun held out his hand and ordered them to stop. He sensed that there were several beasts 900 meters ahead. He saw images of animals. It looked like it was a pack of wolves, and they were attracted to that place by something. And Kai replied with a serious face that the wolves here are bait for monsters. They are regularly fed. It was obviously a bad sign that they were here and the troops were destroyed. Zhang Yuan said that in that case, they needed to take a quick look around. The smell of meat was so strong that even finding its source was not difficult. It seemed to him that this was most likely a trap of some sort. A pack of wolves gathered around a burning bonfire. All the guys were lying in wait. Zhang Yuan said that he could be a decoy to let them show themselves, and Kai interrupted him and told him to wait because there must have been poison, to which the guy replied that he was not afraid of poison. And Kai looked at the guy in surprise and asked if he was serious, and wasn't this ability extremely difficult to absorb. Zhang Yuan confirmed her words indifferently. The girl asked him in a puzzled way who he was, to which the guy briefly replied that he would go ahead. And Kai reached out to him and activated an ability in which, within 5 minutes, Zhang Yuan merges with the environment and becomes invisible. A soft pink color enveloped the girl and the boy. She ordered him to go, saying that they would stay here in case the guy needed to be covered. Zhang Yuan clarified that in the event that he met someone, should he kill them or would it be better to capture them? And Kai immediately replied that Zhang Yuan should shoot immediately to kill in this case. The wolves sniffed the air and noticed a figure approaching them. Their eyes were white and expressionless. At Zhang Yuan's approach, they raised their muzzles to the sky and howled loudly in unison. Zhang Yuan thought to himself that the wolves didn't attack him, but simply wilted, indicating that the enemy was nearby. He sensed several people on either side. Figures of people appeared in his mind. Zhang Yuan immediately reached for his sword, starting to draw it. Well, in this case, it was necessary to clear the field. Countdown 0, 0, 1. Zhang Yuan ran away, and there was a loud explosion behind him. Zhang Yuan immediately charged into the crowd of wolves, cutting off their heads and chopping them apart. After quickly disposing of the animals, Zhang Yuan returned the weapon to its scabbard. The countdown was already at 0, 0, 25. A system notification was displayed that said, "Activate Scorpion Venom." Zhang Yuan glanced behind him, looking carefully in front of him. Zhang Yuan stood in the middle of the corpses of the wolves. A green fog enveloped the space. A system notification was displayed, which again asked, "Activate Scorpion Venom." Zhang Yuan gave the activation signal and a bright blue light seeped out from his chest, enveloping the entire space around him. A system notification flashed that said, "Your abilities have been increased by 108%. Zhang Yuan said with displeasure that the toxin was somehow too weak and completely stupid. And Kai asked the red-haired man what the guy had just said, and the man told her that Zhang Yuan was just complaining that the poison wasn't strong enough. The girl said that the poison lets you know that the enemy was near, and it was urgent to prepare for an attack. They peeked out from the bushes and looked in Zhang Yuan's direction. A bright blue light shrouded him, and his eyes were serious and frowning. All of a sudden, knives stabbed into the two men's heads, hitting them squarely in the forehead. The men immediately fell to the ground. Zhang Yuan muttered in displeasure, clearly dissatisfied that it was over so quickly, and that the enemies were such weaklings. The children sitting in the bushes looked at this picture in surprise, and Kai asked if everyone had seen what she had just seen, to which the pilot replied that the enemy had excellent camouflage and that he didn't even have time to notice anything. And the other man rubbed the bridge of his nose and said that they would rather not talk about it. Zhang Yuan squatted down and said that there was no danger yet, and Kai's eyes were drawn to the knife in the boy's hands, which was covered with traces of blood. It made her uneasy. These flying daggers were similar to the ones that the Surveillance Bureau worked on, and it even has a number on it. It was far from the most popular weapon, maybe a special model. Zhang Yuan was definitely not as simple as he looked. The girl trembled and turned to the guy with an awkward smile, asking him if Xuan Ming was okay and it was better for him to speak directly. Zhang Yuan looked at her questioningly. She thought in horror that he had killed those people so calmly, and it was clearly better for him not to ask such unnecessary questions. The remaining guys came out of the bushes and gave a thumbs up in satisfaction, praising Zhang Yuan and telling him that he was surprisingly good with knives. The red-haired man asked how many years of practice it took to learn how to throw knives so perfectly. Zhang Yuan closed his eyes and indifferently replied that there was nothing wrong with it, and that he was just practicing with plates on a daily basis. The guys were surprised by his answer. With plates, the same device that you stopped using because of the difficulty of training. The red-haired man came closer and with an awkward smile on his face asked, and what was the right way to use this machine so that everything turned out most productively? Zhang Yuan replied that it was normal mode, level by level. The man asked him how he did it back then, since he didn't manage to pass any levels, to which Zhang Yuan replied that he didn't need any special abilities to pass a level. The man immediately drooped and squatted on the side, thinking about how much trash he was compared to him. And Kai approached the young man and asked, did Xuan Ming notice how many abilities they used? Zhang Yuan replied that among them were Wolf Pack Control, Scorpion Venom, and Super Camouflage, at least 3 of them. And Kai grabbed his hand in surprise and asked him if he was sure about the scorpion's poison. And Zhang Yuan was sure because he had the ability to absorb poisons. and Kai immediately put her fist to her heart, paying respect to Zhang Yuan. She said that she thanked Xuan Ming on behalf of all of their team. Many of the fighters are still in the hospital because of that the doctors couldn't accurately detect the poison, and Kai ran to the side with her phone and started calling someone, shouting at the same time to get through to the hospital immediately. Zhang Yuan was next approached by a doctor who said with a smile that the current treatment was not a panacea, and that he had saved so many lives right now. Zhang Yuan, however, was not so impressed and asked if it was really that important. Zhang Yuan thought that apparently, as it turned out, most of the professionals were not so strong, because not everyone was able to absorb the power of the crystal in the end, so it was impossible to do without technology. And Kai looked up from her phone and turned to Zhang Yuan, Xuan Ming, and asked what he thought they should do next. The guys stood in front of the fallen enemies. The guy replied that since their target was poachers, it was best to catch them first. There was no way they could sneak out, so they could at least try to pull it off. It would be best to take someone hostage to arrange negotiations. Single units, such as the ones they had killed, were much easier to intimidate than, for example, ordinary military personnel. And Kai looked at him in surprise, asking what he was suggesting. Just wait for them. Zhang Yuan confirmed. He glanced behind him, frowning, wondering if it was them. His gaze was directed toward the bushes. A group of 4 men appeared in front of them. A dark-skinned guy with dreadlocks tied up, an older man with long blonde hair, and 2 younger men. A man with long blonde hair came out to meet them, his arms spread wide. He greeted them. With a satisfied smile, the man said that they had finally managed to attract such people to this place. He moved closer, stopping next to Kai and adding that what was even more pleasant was the company of such a beautiful lady. The girl blushed slightly and asked dumbfounded what the man was doing here. He didn't answer right away, but then added that he was incredibly grateful because if it wasn't for them, they would definitely have ended. And Kai demanded angrily to stop, to which the man smiled sweetly and apologized. The doctor standing next to Zhang Yuan explained that it was Rob's, and he was one of the strongest guys in all of Germany, so you had to be quite careful with him. The boy asked what about the others, to which the doctor replied that he had never seen the other 2 here before. The pilot held up a finger in front of him and addressed one of the people as Zhao Zhang, asking him why he was alive at all, since he should have been dead, and what he was doing here in the first place. The country invested so much in him, and he got involved with poachers. A man in a dark raincoat, with dark hair and gray eyes, smiled and replied that what kind of investment was there at all, because after his refusal, they suppressed his strength and deprived him of all resources. And if it wasn't for someone else's help, he would never have learned what it means to be free and happy. You can get anything you want, not to mention power. And unlike in China, where ordinary people do not always get to the crystals. Their conversation was interrupted by Zhang Yuan's dagger being thrown at the 2 guys. Energy is used to select the target of the attack. One of the daggers landed right on Zhao Zhang's forehead, knocking him down, and the other dagger that was thrown towards the dark-skinned guy was stopped by his side. He held his hands out in front of him, making the dagger hang in the air. A second later, it clattered to the ground. Zhang Yuan frowned and carefully looked in the direction of the people, noting in surprise that one of them was able to stop his throwing knife. And from the looks of it, he needed to use something else. Robs walked over and picked up the dagger from the ground, looking at it in surprise. He spoke in his own language about how the forging skills in China were truly amazing, and it was a pity that their owner didn't have any grace. And Kai glanced at the guys and asked what he had just said, to which the pilot replied that he seemed to be praising the quality of the knives, while scratching his head uncertainly. Zhang Yuan looked at him and only said nothing in response to his statement. Zhang Yuan spoke in a different language to Robs, telling him that those who insulted his country would be punished, and the traitors would die, and he had no intention of dealing with the future dead. Despite Zhang Yuan's words, Robs only beamed in surprise, smiled at Zhang Yuan and replied in his own language that he was very good at speaking their language, and that he had originally planned to leave them alone, but Zhang Yuan was too interesting a shot. He invited Zhang Yuan to join them, saying that he personally guaranteed excellent conditions. And Kai continued to stand at the side in bewilderment and ask what Robs had just said, to which the youth replied that Robs had said that after killing them all, he wanted to recruit Zhang Yuan. And Kai asked him what he was going to say to that. Zhang Yuan walked up to Robs and held out his hand, demanding that Robs return his knife to him. The doctor wondered why they needed Xuan Ming all of a sudden. A light came on in his hand. Zhang Yuan took the knife, and Robs laughed, spreading his arms wide and adding that in China they say loyalty is above all else. Zhang Yuan grinned and glanced at the doctor from behind. A notification was displayed that the target's ability was increased by 20% for 10 seconds, so the necessary help arrived. Zhang Yuan abruptly stretched out his hand in front of him, and many ice crystals enveloped him. He shouted out that he had already told them that he wasn't going to negotiate with the dead. The men were immediately frozen in place. Robs frowned, the veins standing out on his forehead. He thought about how the vile Chinese dared to sneak up on them, wanting to kill them so easily. Robs glanced viciously at Zhang Yuan, glaring at him. Zhang Yuan looked uneasily in front of him. Robs not only stopped his knife, but also managed to break out of the ice. Just how strong a punch would have to be to deal any damage to it. Robs abruptly appeared at Zhang Yuan's side, grinning all over his face. He clenched his hand into a fist and intended to stab the guy in the stomach, asking him about what he suddenly froze abruptly. The blow landed right on target, and Zhang Yuan was sent flying several meters away, skidding on the ground from such a powerful blow. Two kids ran up to him and lifted him up, trying to hold him in place, and Kai shouted for them to heal him quickly. The doctor put 2 fingers to the boy's neck and said in a dumbfounded voice that it looked like Xuanming was frozen. The rest of the guys looked around uneasily at Zhang Yuan, who was barely able to stand up. The doctor held him by the back and said that he had no heartbeat or breathing. The doctor sat down on the ground, placing Zhang Yuan on his lap. His face was sad. One of the guys said that now was not the time to shed tears, and it was necessary to deal with this scoundrel. Zhang Yuan lay with his eyes closed and thought that he might be cold, but he felt ashamed for them. They just took it and buried it. The defender wrapped his arms around the red-haired boy, shrouding him in a blue aura. Robs looked at them blankly and said they didn't even have to try, because there was no way they could kill him anyway. The red-haired man burst into flames, his hair and eyes lit up, and he said with a smile on his face in his own language that now he would let him show Rob's true strength. The defender immediately jumped away from him due to the fact that it suddenly became hot, and Kai said that this was a unique ability of the fire giant. This guy was a real pro in close combat. The red-haired guy squeezed his hand tightly in his hands and asked the girl what they should do, because his crossbow was melted from the high temperature, and Kai shouted for them to try a mental attack instead. She ordered everyone to prepare. The girl spread her arms out to the sides, and impulses began to radiate from her body. She used the destructive sound wave ability in the 600-meter range. The fiery man fell to his knees and clutched his head, shouting loudly. Robs told them, in his own language, that they had resorted to their tricks again, and that he couldn't just die at this rate, his human body would just burn up. Robs squeezed his eyes shut, pinching the bridge of his nose. He shouted in his own language that he would continue to fight for the glory of his country. Robs clenched his fists tightly, slowly getting to his feet, and Kai said that she didn't understand a word of what he said. The ground was engulfed in flames, and they had to cover their faces. The man replied to the girl that as soon as they were at home, he would definitely study foreign languages. The red-haired man asked him if they were sure they could go back. Zhang Yuan, who was standing behind them, said that they were too much of a match for Robsu and they urgently needed to retreat. Everyone looked in his direction, and Kai looked at him questioningly as Zhang Yuan turned around and said that didn't he tell them that he wasn't just going to die. The doctor frowned and clenched his fists, telling the boy that he was dead, but alive again, and that he was immune to death. Zhang Yuan stood in front of the man and said in his language that Rob's country has always stood for freedom and justice, offering him a fight. Robs clenched his hands into fists and asked why he had to meet him halfway. Zhang Yuan asked if this particular move would kill Robs, and that he couldn't hold out against all of them, but against him alone, he had a pretty good chance. Robs laughed out loud and said that he accepted the offer, and that he was going to show him what Robs was capable of. And Kai, who was standing behind the guy, told him that it wasn't worth it and that Zhang Yuan would only end up dead in the end. Zhang Yuan ignored her words and turned to Robs, telling him not to hold back. The pilot quickly threw Kai over his shoulder and all the guys on the team began to run away. She continued to shout that they couldn't just leave him, to which the doctor replied that their presence would clearly only hinder Zhang Yuan, and that they should trust him. Zhang Yuan had to survive. Rob stood in front of Zhang Yuan and told the guy that he appreciated his bravery and that he was still alive. Zhang Yuan thanked him, but added that there was no need to compare them. Zhang Yuan was surrounded by many ice shards. He added that the person who was supposed to die was definitely not him. A system notification flashed that said, "Your super perception ability has been improved. You got the skill, Fire Strike, can be upgraded. Your freezing ability has been improved. You've got a new skill, Eternal Ice, can't be upgraded. Your regeneration ability has been improved. You have received a new skill, Immortal Body, can be upgraded. Your ability, Furious Strike, has been improved. You have gained a new skill, Battle Master, can be upgraded. Master of Combat, Born to Kill. You can destroy the enemy with any type of weapon." Rob stood in front of him, covered in flames. He asked if this was Zhang Yuan's true strength. As soon as Rob said that they could start, an icy wind enveloped him, wrapping him in a circle of ice. He looked at the boy in surprise. Zhang Yuan said that he had already started. Robs went out, trapped in a ball that shimmered in the air. He stretched out his hand towards Zhang Yuan and didn't understand what was going on and what had happened to him, Why couldn't he make a sound? What kind of invisible air wall? Zhang Yuan told him that it was a special ability that changed the temperature of the air. The formula was simple, he just needed to take into account its temperature and cooling time, so he could change the pressure and the space that surrounds him would turn into a vacuum. Robs clutched at his throat in horror, his eyes almost popping out of their sockets. Zhang Yuan went on to explain and talked about the next stage, which would just burn his human body, but in a vacuum, fire can't exist, so Robs lost to physics. Robs was suddenly thrown into the ice needles, blood spurting from his mouth. Robs fell to the ground. The last thing he managed to say was the apology he made to his little girl about her dad's failure. Robs burst into flames. Zhang Yuan slowly walked over to what was left of him. On the ground, there was a small crystal that gave off fire. The effect is over, now the weakness will come. Robs was surprised that he hadn't lost consciousness, apparently thanks to his enhanced abilities. Zhang Yuan walked over to the crystal and looked at it, looking at it in surprise. A system notification was displayed, which said, "Have you found the crystal? Absorb." Crystal has the following abilities: Incredible Power, red, level 3, cannot be upgraded. Steel Armor, red, level 2, can't be upgraded. Fire Giant, Disaster, level 1, can't be upgraded. Zhang Yuan pondered. Of course, Robs had a special crystal. These don't seem to explode like normal ones, but rather hide inside the body. Why wasn't it mentioned in the textbooks? Zhang Yuan carefully examined the crystal in his hands as he held it closer. The guys might not have known about it either. Perhaps if he did take it, there might be trouble. Most of the abilities couldn't be improved anyway, so it wasn't much use. Zhang Yuan looked back at the abandoned backpacks. He thought about just burying the crystal and pretending that he hadn't seen anything. Since they're poachers, there must be something interesting and useful in the backpacks, right? He walked over to the backpacks and opened the zipper, and a lot of yellow sparkling crystals appeared in front of him. A system notification was displayed that said, "Yellow crystals, available for absorption. Ability, flirtatious, yellow, can be improved. Flirting, show off your charm, quantity, unlimited." Zhang Yuan looked at the crystals dumbfounded, not understanding what they were. And did they really kill a few little bears for this, burn them alive? But since such a person came for these crystals, they must surely be quite valuable. Zhang Yuan stood up and straightened up, picking up his briefcase behind him. He decided that it would be better if he didn't dwell on the name. Maybe it will even become a good and useful skill. Zhang Yuan stood in front of the crystals and began to devour everything. A system notification was displayed that said, "Flirtatious, yellow, maximum level. Your abilities improve when you look cute." Flirtatious, green, maximum level. Your abilities improve when you look cute. A bright yellow light shrouded Zhang Yuan. Another system notification was displayed, which said, "You got a new ability, super cute, red, second level, can be upgraded. Super cute, the enemy can't resist your charm, usage, unlimited." Zhang Yuan drooped. He immediately regretted what he had just done. The guys from the team looked down from above. They stood at the edge, watching the forest from above. The pilot turned to the captain and said that the flames had gone out, which could mean that the battle was over. And Kai thoughtfully said that in that case, they could go down and check on how things were going there. They reached Zhang Yuan. He sat on the edge, looking straight ahead. Clouds were gathering in the sky. They called out to Xu and Ming, and Kai happily ran towards him with tears in her eyes and her arms outstretched. She shouted happily about how she knew for sure that he would survive. However, the girl did not reach and fell, plopping her face on the ground. Zhang Yuan turned in her direction and looked at her awkwardly, saying that the task was completed, and in that case, could she send Zhang Yuan back to the academy as soon as possible? The pilot looked at Zhang Yuan in surprise and asked if he was still a student. Zhang Yuan rose to stand in front of them and smiled as he nodded at the question. He added that his sister was waiting for him so they could have dinner together, and that she would be terribly angry if he didn't show up or was late. They went by helicopter. Zhang Yuan stared at the phone screen and read the messages. The first message was yesterday, at 22 hours 11 minutes, in which it was written, "Why can't I reach you? Forgot to buy a phone charger." The next message was at 6:20, "Why weren't you at breakfast? Something happened." The last one was at 6:31, "Brother, I went to your dorm and you weren't there." Zhang Yuan immediately furrowed his brows and drooped. He thought that when he got back, he would need to explain everything to his sister and Feng King urgently. It's just a pity that the phone didn't pick up the connection here. Zhang Yuan turned to Kai and asked where he could buy a phone that would work in special zones, to which the girl replied that such a phone needed a special permit and the guy would not be able to buy it so easily. The girl smiled and added that if he joined their team, they would help him with this case. Zhang Yuan turned away and replied that he would think about it. And Kai smiled and lowered her head, telling the youth that it was actually worth a try with his strength. Their salaries were decent, and they give out satellite phones to everyone. Zhang Yuan clarified what it was about, and the girl explained what she meant in Chuksu. This is a special department, which had only 9 people, each of whom is strong as a full-fledged team. They usually work independently on particularly complex tasks that were beyond the power of ordinary teams. And Kai smiled coquettishly and put her fingers under her chin and asked if she was interested in the Zhang Yuan app, but he turned away and indifferently replied that no, not really. One of the guys turned to the captain and said that it seems that they were misunderstood at the academy, and the director brought people with him. 3 people were standing on the landing pad below. A gray-haired man with a smile on his face, a man with red hair, and another man with dark hair and a beard. The team landed and the headmaster came to greet them at the academy. He introduced himself and said that he was the director of the academy and was very happy to meet them. He introduced the men on either side of him as well, naming the bearded man Guyan, their dean, and Shan Guan, the red-haired man, as the student representative. And Kai smiled awkwardly and put her arm around Zhang Yuan, who looked exhausted and downcast, telling the headmaster that they had just passed by and decided to drop off one of his students. The headmaster came up in surprise and asked if he really had been to their academy, to which Kai called Xu and Ming and asked why his headmaster didn't know. Zhang Yuan rolled his eyes, looking even more ill. The dean took the president aside and whispered in his ear that this was Zhang Yuan from the special class that Major Lin had personally recommended for admission. The red-haired man had overheard their conversation and was startled on the spot. He frowned and thought to himself, is this trash just getting into their academy because of his connections? Although he had thought that Zhang Yuan was here for special merits, now the man felt cheated. The student representative frowned and shouted to Zhang Yuan that they didn't need trash like him in their academy. He had come to them through his connections and still dared to challenge them. Zhang Yuan indifferently said that he was protesting. Zhang Yuan thought, who was this guy anyway, and why was he so suddenly mad at him? Zhang Yuan turned away and said that he could continue chatting here, but it was time for him to go. The man tried to stop him, but all Zhang Yuan could think about was that if he stayed here any longer, he would definitely miss dinner with his sister. The red-haired man grabbed his arm and stopped him, telling him fiercely that they would fight each other today, even if he didn't try to leave. And Kai smiled and thought to herself that this guy had literally signed his own death warrant. The student representative threw Zhang Yuan over with a sharp movement so that he hit his head on the ground. The girl exclaimed in surprise.